In 1945, American forces intercepted a coded Japanese message that would save thousands of lives. The message revealed detailed plans for a massive kamikaze attack on the Pacific Fleet. But the people who cracked that code weren't seasoned military officers or elite intelligence agents. They were young women, most barely out of high school, working in secret at a former girls' school in Arlington, Virginia. Their names were classified. Their work was buried. And for over 50 years, the world had no idea they'd helped win World War II. In this video, you'll discover the untold story of the women codebreakers of Arlington Hall. You'll learn how these ordinary civilians mastered one of the most complex languages on Earth, cracked codes that baffled military experts, and worked around the clock to give American forces a decisive advantage in the Pacific. Using declassified documents and interviews with surviving codebreakers, we're finally telling the complete story. To understand why these women were recruited, we need to go back to December 1941. Pearl Harbor had just been attacked, and America was thrust into a war on two fronts. In the Pacific, Japan seemed unstoppable. The Japanese military used multiple encryption systems, and their language itself was a fortress. The Army's Signal Intelligence Service, operating out of Arlington Hall Station in Virginia, faced an impossible task. They needed to intercept, decrypt, and translate thousands of Japanese messages every single day. But they had a critical problem. There weren't enough people. So the Army made a radical decision. They would recruit civilians, and not just any civilians. They wanted women. Why women? Military leaders had noticed something during World War I. Women had excelled at repetitive, detail-oriented work in code rooms. They were patient, methodical, and could maintain focus for hours on tasks that drove men to distraction. And perhaps most importantly, they were available. Most young men were being drafted, but there was an enormous pool of educated young women who wanted to serve their country. The recruitment was quiet and unusual. Army representatives visited women's colleges across America. They looked for students who excelled in mathematics, languages, or music. Anyone who could solve puzzles, recognize patterns, or had an ear for linguistic structure. They never mentioned code breaking. They simply said the Army needed clerks for important war work in Washington. For young women in the 1940s, many from rural areas or small towns, it was an opportunity of a lifetime. Anne Caracristy was one of the first recruits. She was a 21-year-old mathematics student from Pennsylvania when an Army officer came to her college in 1942. He asked if she'd be interested in essential war work that would use her education. She said yes immediately. 2 weeks later, she was on a train to Washington with no idea what she'd actually be doing. When she arrived at Arlington Hall, a sprawling complex of buildings surrounded by barbed wire and armed guards, she finally learned the truth. She would be breaking Japanese military codes. Arlington Hall had been a private girls' school before the war. The Army took it over and transformed it into the nerve center of American signals intelligence in the Pacific. By 1943, over 7,000 people worked there, and more than half were women. They worked in former classrooms, now filled with desks, filing cabinets, and miles of intercepted messages on paper strips. The windows were painted over. Armed guards patrolled constantly. Everyone signed secrecy oaths promising never to discuss their work, even with family members. The work was extraordinarily difficult. Japanese codes came in several systems. There was JN-25, the primary naval code, which used 5-digit number groups that corresponded to words and phrases in a massive codebook. Breaking these codes required 3 separate skills. First, you had to understand cryptography, the mathematics of code systems. Second, you had to learn Japanese, one of the hardest languages for English speakers. And third, you had to understand military terminology and operations. The women were divided into teams based on their skills. Some worked on traffic analysis, studying the patterns of radio transmissions. Who was sending messages to whom? How often? At what times? Even without reading the messages, these patterns revealed Japanese military movements. Other women worked as cryptanalysts, the actual code breakers. They spent hours comparing intercepted messages, looking for repeated sequences that might indicate common phrases. Then there were the translators. Once a message was decrypted, it still had to be translated from Japanese to English. Many of the translators had never heard spoken Japanese before joining Arlington Hall. They learned from textbooks, dictionaries, and sheer determination. The daily routine was grueling. Most women worked 6-day weeks with 8 to 10-hour shifts. But when intelligence was urgent, they worked longer. During major Pacific operations, some codebreakers stayed at their desks for 24 hours straight, surviving on coffee and determination. The work was mentally exhausting. Staring at rows of numbers or Japanese characters for hours caused headaches, eye strain, and sometimes breakdowns. Some women cried at their desks from frustration when they couldn't crack a particularly difficult message. But there were breakthroughs. Anne Caracristy made one of the most important discoveries in 1943. She was analyzing a particularly stubborn Japanese army code when she noticed something. Two different messages, sent months apart, contained identical sequences in different positions. She theorized that the Japanese were reusing part of their encryption key, a critical security flaw. She spent 3 weeks testing her theory, building elaborate charts and running probability calculations. When she finally proved she was right, it allowed American cryptanalysts to break into an entire system of Japanese army communications. Her discovery gave Allied commanders advance warning of Japanese troop movements across the Pacific. The women at Arlington Hall developed close bonds. They lived together in boarding houses and shared apartments near the facility. They couldn't talk about their work, even to each other outside the building, so they created a strange double life. During work hours, they were hunting for patterns in Japanese messages, racing against time to prevent American deaths. After work, they went to movies, attended USO dances, and tried to live like normal young women in wartime Washington. But they all carried the weight of knowing that their work directly affected men fighting overseas. One codebreaker, Braden, later recalled the immense pressure. She said every message they broke might save lives. Every message they missed might cost lives. They knew American soldiers and sailors were dying in the Pacific while they sat safely in Virginia. That knowledge drove them to work harder, to find one more pattern, to decrypt one more message. By 1944, the codebreakers at Arlington Hall were reading Japanese military communications faster than the intended Japanese recipients. American commanders in the Pacific had access to enemy plans sometimes before Japanese field officers did. This intelligence, codenamed Magic, shaped every major American operation in the final years of the war. When Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, was flying to inspect Japanese positions, Arlington Hall intercepted and decrypted the message giving his exact flight plan. American fighters were waiting. They shot down his plane, killing Japan's most brilliant naval strategist. The codebreakers tracked Japanese reinforcements heading to various islands, allowing American submarines to intercept and sink transport ships. They identified which Japanese units were undersupplied or demoralized. They revealed the locations of ammunition dumps, headquarters, and communication centers. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea, decrypted messages allowed American carriers to position themselves perfectly for what became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, where American pilots destroyed over 600 Japanese aircraft in 2 days. When Japan finally surrendered in August 1945, the women of Arlington Hall had been working non-stop for nearly 4 years. They had processed millions of messages. They had mastered one of the world's most difficult languages. They had cracked codes that military experts said were unbreakable. Historians now estimate that the intelligence produced at Arlington Hall shortened the war by at least a year, saving hundreds of thousands of American and Allied lives. But when the war ended, something remarkable happened. Nothing. There were no medals, no ceremonies, no public recognition. The women were simply told their work was still classified. They were ordered never to speak about what they'd done. Many were offered positions in the newly forming peacetime intelligence agencies, but most returned to normal life, carrying a secret they could never share. They went to college, got married, raised families, and never told anyone, not even their husbands or children, that they'd been codebreakers. For decades, the women remained silent. The government kept their work classified long after World War II ended. It wasn't until the 1990s, nearly 50 years later, that documents about Arlington Hall began to be declassified. Some of the women had died by then, their contributions unrecorded. Others were elderly, but finally able to talk about what they'd done. Anne Caracristy, the mathematician who made the critical breakthrough in 1943, stayed in intelligence work. She eventually became the deputy director of the National Security Agency, the highest position ever held by a woman in American intelligence at that time. But even her own family didn't know the full story of her war work until the declassifications began. The story of Arlington Hall challenges our understanding of World War II. We remember the soldiers who stormed beaches, the pilots who flew combat missions, the sailors who fought at sea. But behind them was an army of invisible contributors. Young women who used their minds instead of weapons, who fought with mathematics and linguistics instead of bullets, who worked in secrecy instead of glory. Their battlefield was a former girls' school in Virginia, and their weapons were pencils, paper, and determination.
These women were told their work was just clerical, just supporting the real codebreakers. But they were the codebreakers. They were told to keep quiet, and they did, for half a century. They asked for nothing in return. No recognition, no gratitude, no place in history books. They simply did the work because their country needed it done. The next time you think about World War II, remember Arlington Hall. Remember the young women who learned Japanese in a few months, who stared at encrypted messages until patterns emerged, who worked through exhaustion and doubt because American lives depended on them. They couldn't carry weapons. They couldn't serve in combat. But they found another way to fight, and they won battles that were never announced, never celebrated, and never forgotten by those who knew the truth. They were invisible warriors in a secret war, and they were absolutely essential to victory.